Hello everyone, and after a bit of a break, Advocate of Pants here with the next installment of the Advocate Discusses Magic the Gathering. Now, as I alluded to toward the end of the last video, I'll be shifting gears to going from talking about the story within the game and stuff to talking about the game itself. Specifically, my thoughts about various aspects like the mechanics and stuff. Basically, just talking about what I think in regards to the way different cards work and just talk about my experience with the game and stuff. And also, as I mentioned last time, this will be done on the assumption that the viewers have at least a basic idea of what Magic's all about in terms of what kind of a game it is and how it works. Not necessarily, like, you don't have to really know how to play very much, just know what the game is. So with that being said, let's get right into it. Now, I have a lot to say, more so about the game rather than the story, because when I first started playing the game, I didn't really know much about the story until later on. So more of my experiences with playing the card game, getting a lot of the different cards and stuff. So I'll try not to ramble on too much, but no promises. So in a nutshell, the game just there's a lot to it. There's a lot of different mechanics. There's a lot of different kinds of cards. There's all different settings where each card set takes place, and in most cases they try to make the card mechanics reflect where they happen in the story. Sometimes the cards are designed first, sometimes the story is made first. Really, the end result is the same, but the origin is usually kind of obvious. Like with the Innistrad block, mostly the first two sets, Innistrad and Dark Ascension, that was more of a flavor-based block where the cards were designed in a way, basically all kinds of references to horror films and stuff, and they just kind of wrote the story to work that in, make that kind of thing make sense. And in other cases you have the opposite, where they make the story from scratch and then they make the cards from that. And again, in some cases it tends to be obvious when that's done. Like if it's a heavy story driven thing, like with, like most recently, Khans of Tarkir, the premise is Tarkir going backwards in time, and we've just passed the midpoint of the story with Fate Reforged, with Ugin basically coming back, just kind of going, what if he hadn't been defeated by Nicobolas? What if Nicobolas had been the one to lose the fight or whatever? However, they're kind of incorporating that. Basically, the dragons are back on Tarkir, and we're way in the past. So, in both cases, the mechanics are apparent, they make sense, and for the most part, I like how they do that. Now, some mechanics don't quite make sense. Like for me, personal experience, one mechanic that I've actually had to play with, been able to use, is the Clash mechanic that was actually present in Lorwyn and in Morningtide. That one was one of those, when you played a card that had it, You play the card, it gets its effect, and then you clash with your opponent, and then if you win, you get a bonus. If not, nothing. And the way the clash works is you and your opponent, you reveal the top card of your deck. Yours has the higher mana cost, you win. It Yeah, it was just one of those that made people kind of wonder what was going on, and it wasn't a hard one to understand. It was just useless because you gave your opponent free information, and that's an example where that kind of thing isn't really worth what you get in return. Now, some cards have effects that you reveal your hand to your opponent so they get to see what you have, or that you have the risk of giving them something. Now, some of those effects aren't bad. Like, one example is a creature known as Goblin Guide. 1 red mana for a 2/2 guy with haste, but when he attacks, your opponent reveals the top card of their library, their deck, and if it's a land, they get to draw it. If it's not a land, they just leave it where it is. So, yeah, you run the risk of accelerating your opponent, but at the same time, 2 damage right away. Like if you're going first and he's the first creature on the field, that can hurt. Other examples of mechanics that kind of were kind of a swing and a miss based on ones that I've actually been able to use. The chroma mechanic that was actually, while it was teased in future sites on the card Phosphorescent Feast, it was officially used in the Eventide set, and it was a counting game. Basically, you counted the mana symbols within a certain zone, and something happened based on how many mana symbols of the appropriate color you had. And so that could be what's on the field, on your side of the field, what's in your hand, or reveal the top so many cards of your deck and then count the mana symbols there. I didn't really get to use it too much, but there were only a few cards that were really useful with that. Like Phosphorescent Feast, you gain life. Primal Crux was a creature that got exponentially larger for each, based on how many green mana symbols you had. And there was a blue card. It costs 3 blue mana, and then you reveal the top 10 cards of your deck, and for each blue mana symbol in those cards' mana costs, your opponent milled a certain number of cards. So that's one. It can be brutal, but again, it's one of a few. The most of them just kind of, no one really used them. And part of the problem was it was one of those more confusing mechanics. Like Wizards even admitted it didn't work very well, and so they turned it into the devotion mechanic from Theros. I do have a devotion based deck, and I can say devotion is good. It's really powerful if you can get it to work. And mine's a green devotion deck, so it works on getting a lot of mana very fast, partly through Karamatra's Acolyte, which it makes green mana. You tap it for green mana equal to your devotion, to green, and then there's Nykthos, which is a land that kind of does the same thing, but it's devotion to color of your choice. Pay 2 mana and tap, and you get that, or you just tap for colorless. And yeah, I can definitely say devotion is a good mechanic. It's one of my It's one of my favorites. Another of my favorites being the infect mechanic that was present in Scars of Mirrodin. That's another one I have a deck built around. And the point behind infect is it's an alternate way of killing creatures or killing your opponent. And it's actually a fusion of 2 mechanics. One is Wither, which was another Shadowmoor and Eventide mechanic, and then the other is the Poisonous mechanic that was kind of introduced in Future Sight, but it was something that had actually been used long, long ago, where there were creatures that if they attacked but were not blocked, even if they didn't deal damage, they gave your opponent a poison counter, and if they hit 10 poison counters, they died. The way the Poisonous mechanic worked in Future Sight, of course, it had a number, and so when they dealt combat damage to your opponent, they took that much regular damage and again the specified number of poison counters, so it was a quicker way of killing by poison. And then in Scars of Mirrodin, we got Infect. And it works the way Wither does if it hits a creature, but if it hits a player, then it just replaces the damage with poison counters. So, and then if it hits a creature, of course it shrinks them, and so damage is being dealt in the form of counters of some kind. So it can be confusing to someone who is just kind of getting into the game. It's one of those you gotta really take some time to get used to it. But really, I don't mind the mechanics like that. I mean, even the basic ones like flying and first strike, even those have a bit of complexity to them in that some of them change the way creatures attack or block. Then there's the ones like flash or split second. They change the way you can cast a spell or changes the way your opponent can respond to it. You have morph and now manifest, which are alternate ways of getting a creature on the field. You have cycling, which you pitch a card from your hand and draw a new card, or pitch the card to tutor for something else. Transmute kind of work the same way. And some of those mechanics, like some of the ones like cycling, for example, those are more utility based. And then you have ones like Unearth from Shards of Alara or Flashback, which was most recently reused in Innistrad. Things that let you get extra usage out of the things that you play. Like Unearth resurrects a creature for the turn and then it goes away permanently. Flashback, same deal, except it works on spells where you just cast it from the graveyard for an alternate cost and then it goes away. And in the case of Flashback, it's one of those that you build a deck around it because just the synergy, the way you have all of these different kinds of cards and then getting to basically use each one twice. Depending on the card or depending on what's being used, it's kind of hard to come back from that. And well, I don't really rely on Flashback too much. Like I have cards that have it. I've used Flashback. I just never really built a deck around it or anything. And so it's one that I've heard about it and I know what it can do in terms of decks that are built to utilize it. Other such decks are like the combo decks, mainly ones that utilize the storm mechanic. Basically gives you a way of copying your spells based on how many other things that were played. Most of the time, if you're building a deck to utilize storm, it also uses a lot of cards with the suspend mechanic, which basically pay a cost and remove the card from the game for a certain number of turns, and you play it for free. And any creatures that come in that way have haste, so basically you suspend a lot of things, they come in, and then you use your storm spells, and they have their effect, and then most and some iterations of the deck have a card from in a strat called Past in Flames, and it gives all your instants and sorceries flashback equal to their mana cost. So you just recast them all, do it again, and then use the flashback cost on Past in Flames to do the whole thing over again. And most of the time it's just utilized, it's a way of using all of your direct damage spells multiple times until you win. In the case of the Infect deck, you just do 10 damage through poison counters as quick as possible. Those tend to be your more, like in the case of the Infect deck, that's more of an aggressive strategy. The combo decks, like the Past in Flames decks, some of those are more aggressive based. Some of them are kind of a mix between speed and control, so they kind of fall into the mid-range category. I've played just about any kind of deck you can have. Like, I've played the fast decks, I've played the control decks, I've played the more mid-range decks, and even in more recent sets, just the card pool, it's constantly changing, so these same deck types are always changing. And while it's good to see what new mechanics and stuff they come out with, like, it tends to be one of my favorite parts of going to a pre-release or something, getting to see all this new stuff. But in terms of more competitive play, the standard format of competitive play, with all this constant rotation, it can get kind of hard to keep up with it. Like, you build a deck, and then a year later, you gotta build a new deck, or you gotta basically, like, sometimes you're forced to just build a new deck from scratch because the cards that rotate out, there aren't any suitable replacements for them. So you just, with the rotation, becomes a brand new metagame. You know, all these brand new decks being used, and then you have the non-standard formats where things don't rotate. They just the card pool just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So in those cases, the diversity of the kinds of decks it gets bigger. The only problem is the barrier to entry. Well, you know, you see all these older mechanics and cards and stuff, and you find new ways of exploiting them. Card availability tends to be the main issue in those non-standard formats, where standard is just being able to constantly update your collection or whatever. And so that's why most people don't worry about it too much. For me, with the constant rotation and stuff, I'm not always able to get new cards immediately or whatever. So for me, I'm one of those people, I tend to follow the non-standard formats more than anything. Especially the modern constructed format, because it's cards from my time being in the game. It's a lot of this. It's some stuff from before I actually started playing, and then everything that's been around since I've been playing the game. So I see a lot of these cards that I recognize, some that I've actually used, and beyond that, I'm also more of a casual player. Though I've played in tournaments, I just, more often than not, I don't worry too much. You know, with a pre-release, I'm there to get new cards. And in the case of getting in, like, the game day tournament or a Friday Night Magic tournament, I just go there, play some Magic, and mainly just kill time. That's really all. At the end of it, while I admit it's, it's probably kind of silly, it's just my take on the game. I'm I've always been more of a casual. I probably would be considered semi-casual based on my experience. Like if I'm in a regular tournament, I do go in there to do the best that I can. Usually I'll have a deck that will just come together, or sometimes I'll just restructure a theme deck and go in there with that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But either way, I go in there, I play some games, socialize a bit, and I have fun with it actually. And that's one reason why I like the casual, you know, play style more than anything. Some of the more casual formats can get pretty crazy, and it's definitely a great way to pass the time. Like you go there, meet up with some people, and you could easily kill the better part of a day just goofing off, playing cards and stuff. And I've had plenty of fond memories of that. And most recently, now on Saturdays, I go over to my local gaming store, and me and some other people, we meet up there and we play Commander. And sometimes it's a standard free-for-all Commander, and then we've also done the Allies format, we've done Emperor, we've done Two-Headed Giant, and we do all these different things, and pretty much all of us have multiple decks, so we're just shifting things up all the time. And it's got an appeal that the tournament scene, the more competitive formats, don't have. And yeah, it has its own bit of fun, but the problem that the various constructed, the standard and then the non-standard formats, the mechanics are cool, the kinds of decks are cool, but it gets stale with something as diverse as Modern or Legacy. It's not a problem because there's just so many different kinds of decks you can use. But with Standard, you got this constantly shifting card pool, so you see a lot of the same decks, or you see a lot of the same cards in everybody's deck, and it's one thing that does kind of kill it for me, where it's just like you're essentially forced to either run a particular card or set of cards or play a particular kind of deck, or be prepared with something to counter it. You, you're either you're either kind of forced to go with the meta game or go with a rogue deck and hope you don't get steamrolled. And sometimes the rogue decks work. The rogue, like the decks that no one's expecting, and yeah, you can have some fun kind of experimenting with that. But it's really just a matter of having the patience or whatever. And for me, it it's not really a priority for me. I mean, if I have the cards for a certain deck, I'll just throw it together the best I can, kind of replace cards as I can. Otherwise, yeah, I like casual play more than anything because you can use whatever you want. Now, in terms of mechanics that I don't really like too much, I mentioned Clash, I mentioned Chroma. Beyond that, there's not too many other ones. Now, I mentioned liking Devotion, and in fact, I like Suspend. I like the Scry mechanic. Most recently was in Theros. And I like what's in Cons of Tarkir. Like more prior to Cons of Tarkir bringing it back, it was the one that Time Spiral had brought back, and it's one that I've used. I used it back in Time Spiral. I've gotten to use it with Cons of Tarkir, and now Fate Reforged now has Manifest to kind of go alongside Morph. So I like that kind of direction that they took with it, because they've actually, it's the latest in their pattern of bringing back old mechanics. And in the case of M14 and M15 creature types, those being the return of slivers, the sliver creatures, and yeah, I like seeing them reuse mechanics, partly to see what they do with it when they bring it back, see what if they can provide any new twists, like with multi-kicker back in World Wake, for example, or of course, Manifest being derived from Morph. And there are some mechanics that I didn't really get to use much. In terms of more recent mechanics, there was the Constellation mechanic from Journey to Nyx. It's one that something happens when an enchantment hits your side of the field. Most of the things that have it are also enchantments themselves, mainly enchantment creatures, because that was the gimmick behind the Theros block. It was the enchantment block in terms of mechanics, card mechanics. But in terms of its story, it was Greek mythology. So it's one that there was a bit of a shift, like with Kamigawa. Japanese mythology was the inspiration, but within terms of the card sets, the legendary super type was the main focus. All these different legendary creatures, and then even legendary artifacts and enchantments. One of Theros' main draws were not just the different kinds of enchantment whatevers, the god cards, which they were all legendary enchantment creatures, all had the god creature type. They were all indestructible. If your devotion to a specified color wasn't high enough, they were not creatures, they were just legendary enchantments. But regardless, they still have a couple pretty powerful effects, and when they are creatures, they have some pretty good stats to back them up. I have a couple of them, but I just use them for Commander, but they're still good no matter what you tend to use them for, and there are a lot of decks that utilize them. With the advent of Khans of Tarkir, not as much. There's more three-color decks than there was prior, but that isn't to say those cards aren't good. They're an example. In some cases, a card is pretty good, but certain things come along that kind of trump that, and sometimes it's the opposite, where something is kind of bad, but something that comes along later complements it, makes it pretty good. In terms of times that's happened, the cards that go through that, they tend to be called sleeper cards, because people see it and they're like, that's kind of pointless. But then later on, wait a minute. Though sometimes it takes them a while. And those interactions, while they are cool, sometimes they've gotten a little out of hand, like the kinds of combos that can happen from them. Sometimes they're found that they weren't intended to be there. As such, it's kind of an accidental oversight. And the kinds of decks that utilize that, a lot of times you really gotta look into it to exploit mechanics and stuff like that. I'm not one to really go out of my way to do that. I just play the cards as they are. If I find stuff that works together, I'll do that. But I'm not really one to just experiment like that unless it's just I feel like messing around with a casual deck of some kind. Most of the time my approach is just get a theme deck. Sometimes I'll modify a theme deck as I mentioned before, or I'll just get one of the side products and then have that just mess around with anyone who's willing. That Or often than not, I just try to have fun with it. The mechanics are cool, and really, there are a few cases where the mechanics are designed and they ended up being too powerful. Like some feel that the Planeswalker card type is one such thing, where it's one of those pretty complex aspects of the game where it's essentially you cast this thing and then it has these different effects that you have to pay different kinds of costs to use, and in combat they can be attacked. Outside of combat they can be dealt damage, and there is no simple way of explaining planeswalkers. It's when you really got to pay attention. You got to have someone show you how they work. The legend rule, while complex, just a matter of memorization. There can only be one of a particular creature on your side of the field. Planeswalkers work in a similar manner, but it's their type rather than their actual name. So now prior to Magic 2014, they didn't work that way, but Wizards, they decided to change it because of the way the pro players were exploiting the legend rule or the planeswalker rule, and they didn't like that because to them it it turned those cards into what they were not intended to be, turned them into kill spells, and they weren't meant to be used that way. I can understand their reasoning behind that, but one of the things they mentioned was interactivity. It's like, okay, that's just stupid, because now the rule is both you and your opponent can have a copy of the planeswalker or the legendary thing, and that's kind of stupid, really. And in terms of interactivity, it makes it worse in a way because it just makes it that much harder to deal with your opponent's stuff. And then if it's your own stuff, it makes it a lot more powerful because exploiting the legend rule still happens, but the way it happens now, whether it's a legendary thing or a planeswalker, you play one, use it, play a second, sacrifice the first by the legend rule, and then you just get to use it again. Needless to say, some legendary cards and even some planeswalkers, they gained a lot of value because of that. And so in hindsight, it's like, oops. But they don't plan on changing it, so we just have to kind of go with it. Now, when the planeswalkers were first introduced back in Lorwyn, I thought they were pretty cool looking, but I didn't have any. At the time, they were rare. The mythic rarity didn't exist until Shards of Alara. That was kind of a dumb idea, only only for the fact that at the same time that was when they decided to shrink the set sizes. And their reasoning behind shrinking the sets was the collector market. Pointless pandering to the collector market, and then there's the reserve list, which is the same deal. And the mythic rarity, it made certain things like planeswalkers and stuff that much harder to get a hold of. I mean, they already had a lot of value, but they're just that much harder to get a hold of. And then in some cases, when they're talking about how they designed a set or something, to talk about not having enough space in the set to explore what they want to explore, well, you shouldn't have shrunk the sets. You wouldn't have had to worry about that. Because I would have liked to see more mechanics in a set, or more cards with a particular mechanic. Like in Ravnica, I started with the original Ravnica back when I first started playing the game, and so for me, anytime they have a multicolor themed block, I'm definitely interested because yeah, I like the multicolor things, and then two color, three color, and that's one theme. Especially with Ravnica introducing hybrid mana, Shadowmoor brought that back, Return to Ravnica again, and now most recently, there was Shards of Alara using it in some manners. And now we have Fate Reforged using hybrid mana symbols. I like the hybrid mana because it's it gives you an extra bit of versatility. Now, hybrid mana is kind of a back and forth thing. Some get confused by it, but it's not too bad. It's not too hard to explain. There's always going to be mechanics like that. There's some easy ones, there's some kind of in the middle, and then there's some not so easy ones. And as mentioned, I have my favorites, and then I've got some that I didn't really care for. And some of them are fun, some of them not so much. That's usually the way they end up being used, or the way they're designed. Yeah, that's about all I can say about that. I mean, this game is constantly changing with each new set that comes out, all these new mechanics coming in. In some cases, you got ones that get to come back for a second try, which actually, there were times in the past when they would do that, but it wasn't very often. Time Spiral was the first block that they could showed that they could really bring stuff back and use them in new ways, and Shards of Alara made that official, with it bringing back the cycling ability on certain cards, and then they just continue that trend. And then with M11, they started using it in core sets. I'm I'm a fan for the most part. So yeah, I think that's. I may have repeated myself at some point, but eh, I just there's a lot to say about this stuff. I mean, overall, my experience with the game has been positive. I've met some pretty good people. I've had a lot of fun with playing the game. I've enjoyed using all these different kinds of mechanics and stuff. When I was just getting started in the game, I had a few people that were willing to help me out, and they were nice about it. And over time, I was just able to figure things out on my own, to the point where I was able to help other people pick this stuff up, kind of explain things here and there, even with some of the rules changes that have happened over the time that I've been playing. To summarize the whole thing, overall, I do like the mechanics of the game. I like the game itself, but more often than not, I prefer to just play it, to have fun with it. It is a hobby. It is a game. It's the same with being you playing video games or whatever. I have fun with it, and while it would be kind of cool to take it to that higher level, it's not a priority. So yeah, that's my opinion on it. That's how I feel. It's based on my personal experiences, and that's the way I like it. Yeah, so that I'd say that adequately summarizes my personal thoughts on the whole thing. So yeah, with this long-winded thingamajig out of the way, I will go ahead and wrap it up here. And in the meantime, until the next video, hmm, I've got to brainstorm a new topic. So until then, Advocate of Pants signing off. Take care, everyone.